This is Beatles 60. 60?
60 years ago today. 60 years ago today. 60 years ago.
60. Beatles 60. We're jumping around.
There's a fascinating perspective from author Jude Sutherland Kessler on the apparent deeper meaning that John Lennon associated with Baby It's You. A new take on what John was probably feeling as he sang the song, or more specifically, who John might have been privately singing to. This is confidently and clearly brought to light in Jude's book, Shivering Inside, which I recommend. It covers 1962 into early 1963, including 60 years ago now, and including the full day and night recording in February 63 of most of this album at EMI. People unfamiliar with Jude's work might assume that it's like wild fiction, like fan fiction or something. But not at all. Her Lennon books, though they read like novels, are extremely well-researched, jam-packed with footnotes. She's studied Beatlejohn over the course of an entire career and published his biography across a series of books. His story is interpreted with a high level of integrity, clarity, and confidence. Jude knows, or knew, a lot of the people who were close to John. Even the parts that seem like speculation are more in the realm of, I don't know it for a fact, I just know it's true. She knows her subject. Jude's take on John's state of mind during the recording of Baby It's You will fascinate anyone familiar with his story and the song. She shows us that, consciously or not, John was really singing the song to, guess who? To his mother, Julia. It doesn't matter what they say, I know I'm gonna love you any old way, what can I do? Don't leave me all alone, come on home. She knows this almost for a sad fact, that it's the case. I'll read the passage aloud to you in a moment. Just want to share with you something the author mentioned to me in an email the other day. The scene I'm about to narrate to you takes place at EMI Studios as they're recording Baby It's You, the second to last song they'll record in this session. Famously, Twist and Shout was saved for last. I'm so bored with people pointing that out. It's like, oh, for fuck's sake. Yeah, for the millionth time. Yeah, his voice on Twist and Shout is the end of the day, blah, 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 blah. So, this is just before Twist and Shout. And all the dialogue here is verbatim. She got it directly from John C. Wynn's meticulous transcription of the actual EMI files. So all that was said between takes is, what they said. She just wants to note, she wanted me to note that we're fortunate to have John C. Wynn's work, and she was fortunate to have it for her books, for this and so many other purposes. He's like the world's top archivist of recorded Beatles material, audio, video, film. We're not talking about text, but audio-visual. And not just EMI materials, but all interviews, everything. John C. Wynne gets high praise from the likes of Mark Lewison and Jude Kessler. Setting the scene now, okay? London, EMI.
The 11th
of February, 1963. A little more than 60 years ago. Almost a year before we get the album in the States. They started late morning and now it's late evening. Rome was not built in a day, but the Beatles' first album was, most of it. They still need to record a couple more songs. Again, the last one, but there's a penultimate one. Up in the control room, You have an exhausted George Martin, an exhausted Norman Smith, tape engineer, probably exhausted. I forget his name, sorry. Downstairs, you have an exhausted but determined Beatles. Okay, here's the passage.
Well,
Martin yawned and rubbed the back of his neck. They were going on 11.5 hours now.
what do we have left, Norman?
2 to go. That's it.
Boys,
Martin said over the intercom.
what's next?
John and Paul exchanged glances with one another. They both knew that John had reached the breaking point. He was shivering and alternately perspiring. He'd consumed almost all the zoobs and downed a ghastly amount of milk. If anything, he was getting worse rather than better.
John's got one more.
Paul knew he could do it.
Baby, it's you.
John glanced up at Martin, nodding nonchalantly. He stood erect, widened his base, chewed his gum, and even forced himself to smirk a little.
All right, when you're ready then.
Martin bought the ruse. 9:45 p.m., 1 hour to go. It was one of John's favorite covers, and
in retrospect,
he thought,
if I had the day to do it all over again, I would have recorded it earlier, and my voice was still intact.
like George's Chains, the key of Baby It's You was geared for the Shirelles. And although John's range was respectable, his ability to use it now was terribly impaired. Besides, it was another sojourn into emotion, and John's ends were frayed. It was the one song that reminded him most of Julia. Even the song's unexpected key changes, the sudden shifts from minor to major, conjured up her inimitable quirkiness, her unanticipated flights of imagination. To John, the song had always been about her. It was a song of love. Growing up in Mendip's orderly walls, he'd heard nothing but chastisement about his mother from her censorious sister.
Flighty, unbridled, utterly bohemian, irresponsible,
And even once whispered low,
immoral.
Through the days and ways of the years, Mimi had volumes to say about her sister's behavior. Even Uncle Judge, who'd been kinder and more subtle, had employed
Inattentive,
then
somewhat fly-by-night.
when speaking of Julia. But John had never bought it. He'd never been convinced that the woman who laughed with utter mirth, hugged him with intensity, and enjoyed life so completely was an unforgivable sinner. Quite the contrary, he had dubbed Julia his patron saint. He saw in her a holy light.
It doesn't matter what they say. I know I'm gonna love you any old way.
He'd sung night after night in Hamburg, Manchester, Runcorn, Aberdeen, Birkenhead, Newcastle upon Tyne, Preston, Lancashire, Liverpool, and all points in between. And every time he hurled the words towards the footlights, he offered them up for Julia. He wanted to sing her song now, one more time, for the record, he smirked. If only he could find the voice. Smith uttered. Paul and George began their hush, la-la-la-la intro.
Sha-la-la-la-la.
John took a deep breath and willed himself to perform.
Last song of the fucking evening. Last one you have to do. Give it all you got. Go on.
He urged himself. George's duojet backed him with a dry, empty hum, the sound John had felt since July of '58, when a drunk driver had robbed him of Julia forever, when he'd lost his mother a second time to death. As Ringo brushed the drums with the subtle swish of an offbeat heart, a heart very nearly broken, John stepped up to the microphone, closed his eyes, and let the words spill out. Immediately, John was in the moment, standing at the door of 1 Blomville Road, hearing a uniformed policeman ask,
Is this the home of Julia Stanley, son? Did she live here, as it were?
He could hear John Dyken's screams as he collapsed to the floor, could feel the octopus arms of family strangers tentacling him in that cold hospital corridor. He could feel the rain as they lowered Julia's casket into the earth, could smell the summer, the loss, the anger. John was back there again, right where he'd left himself 4 summers ago.
Don't want nobody, nobody.
'Cause baby, it's you.
Head tilted back, throat burning with overuse and emotion, John forced music into the air and strummed his guitar with pain. Inside that dark, horrific void that nothing ever seemed to fill, John sang. It wasn't something he went on about with the others. He imagined George knew, Paul as well, but John didn't slobber about his loss. Day in, day out, he masked it. In a way, his mourning had become a physical disability, something permanent that maimed. But years ago, John had learned to get up early every morning and do something. He'd learned to compensate for the depression fogging his head by plodding on, even with his gut in knots. He'd learned to manage, plying wit, scathing satire, and feigned indifference as his weapons. The defense, however, never really shielded him. In fact, he'd come to regard his existence as half meaningless. It took 3 more tries to get the number the way John wanted. 3 more tries to hit upon a balance of emotion, sound, style, and technique. But he did it.
So how was that? I'm glad I was able to share that extended passage with Jude's kind permission, but there's so much more there. Buy the Kindle book. I recommend it. It's cheap. You can get it right now. Just go to Amazon, get the Kindle book. Shivering Inside, Pen in Ink Publishing, 2010. You can just find it. Just do a search. Jude Kessler, Shivering Inside. Other authors have noted that John's rendering of this song impressed Brian Epstein at the Cavern. Now, in the control room at EMI, I mean, you can just imagine them all looking down, thinking, holy fuck, what did we just record? Wow. I wonder if they knew that they made history. I don't know. The guys soldiered through this marathon recording work with utter professionalism. John and Paul were both sick, but they were desperate to make it happen, and they did. Very few of the people mentioned just now are still living. From the group, of course, John and George are no longer with us. As of last month, with Burt Bacharach's passing, all 3 songwriters are gone. Brian Epstein, George Martin, deceased. And, of course, Julia Lennon was killed in a tragic accident in 1958. Such a great song, I thought it deserved a special spotlight. And when I talked about songwriters, I only mean Baby It's You. They didn't write the whole album. We'll see. There's a lot to be said about that. Well, I should mention this is Beatles 60. We ain't jumping around. I'm Larry. It's still the 4th week of March, and we're marking the 60th anniversary of the release of the Beatles' first LP, Please Please Me.
This is Beatles 60.
This was only part of a longer audio podcast. You can find 1 or 2 other parts of this episode on our YouTube channel. We post audio to YouTube only in short segments to make them easy to share. If your purpose is to share short segments of our audio podcast, then the YouTube clips can be convenient, but our YouTube channel is just for segments. It's audio, so there's nothing to look at. We're not really interested in producing video content. So, for Beatles 60, to tell you the truth, the YouTube channel is really where the action isn't. If you want a continuous listening experience for yourself while washing up or while hiking or while commuting, similar to listening to audiobooks, then we recommend getting our full podcast episodes automatically sent to your phone or your tablet or your PC every month. Use a podcast app. It's easy to find us and subscribe. There's a link in the show notes, or you can always go to Beatles60.group. You see, you navigate down to one of the episode pictures on the front page, and then you tap that, and then there's a description of the episode, and then listen now, and then you tap that, and you can choose any podcast app that works for you. Or you could listen right there if you want to.
This is Beatles 60.
The interval between this podcast and our next podcast will, 60 years ago, have been the exact same interval.
Get the idea? The Beatles will have experienced the exact same number of days, same season. All of you who've been following this real-time chronicle with us already get the pace.
You already understand, right? Same speed. Technically, we'd call this a longitudinal phenomenological historiographic study.
Larry.
Eh?
What's with all the academic jargon?
Well, this is a serious series. The Earth turns at one speed and in one way, am I right? At least in lived experience, last I looked. Now remember, the future is unwritten.
Ultimately, we're talking about human experience. We can't walk in the Beatles' boots if we're jumping around all different billions and billions of years, as nothing would make any sense.
So come on, we gotta repeat that slogan. This is a chronicle.
Beatles 60. We ain't jumping around.